Assistant Leader Clyburn set us up to move seamlessly into a discussion of the CHIPS Act, IRA recent legislation, and we are honored here again now to have our second featured speaker, Ronnie Chatterji. So Ronnie is here on our Zoom. Let me make sure that we can spotlight him appropriately. Hello, Ronnie.
Hey, Danny. Can everyone hear me okay and see me okay?
You're A-okay. We've got you.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Ronnie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm on a first name basis with Ronnie. He and I were chief economist counterparts, me at OMB, Ronnie at the Commerce Department. And let me just give the quick introduction for Ronnie. I want to keep us on time here, as Ronnie is still serving and has probably back-to-back meetings as well in the White House. So since November, Ronnie has served as lead coordinator for the implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act at the White House. He currently serves as acting deputy director of the National Economic Council in the Biden White House, Council of Economic Advisors. He is an academic. He is currently on leave from the Fuqua School at Duke, where he is the Mark Burgess and Lisa Benson-Burgess Distinguished Professor of Business and Public Policy. And most importantly of all, Ronnie received his PhD from the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. With that, Ronnie, take it away. And if time permits, we'll have a couple minutes of questions at the end. So folks, please enter in your questions in the box in Zoom and we'll get to them if we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. And I will try to be brief and leave some good time for questions, because as I look around the Zoom screen, I see people who I've learned a ton from in my career, including Danny Yeagan, who I had the honor to serve with when he was the chief economist at OMB, and enjoyed his academic work before I even knew him as a colleague. Tim Bartik, Renee Bowen, Mark Murrow, Jonathan Kruber. I'm just looking at the first part of my Zoom screen. Liz Reynolds is waiting over there on the second screen, and I'm sure many other folks that I've worked with. And so this is a group I definitely want to hear from, and I know there's many more on Zoom that I can't see that I'd love to get your questions and comments. So I'll give a quick overview of kind of what I'm doing here and where I think it fits into this conference. It's really great to be back at Berkeley, even virtually. The only thing Danny didn't mention is go Bears. So I have to say that anytime I do something Berkeley-wise. I really think that the work we've been doing over the last 2.5 years in the Biden administration is so relevant to this community. And as I think about the research that people here are doing, this is really our moment as a research and policy community. And I know many of you reading your recent work are seizing that moment. And I just want to use this time to emphasize where I think some of the most interesting pathways are going to be, where I've seen some of our research inform policy, and where I've seen us fall short, with the hope that this collective group can do great things in the next decade as these programs start to unfold. So that's my goal in terms of how I think about it, and I hope you all will find it useful. I'll start when I got to the Commerce Department. There was the Economic Development Administration, EDA. EDA is really the only agency in the federal government tasked with place-based regional economic development in the United States. And it's a legacy of the Great Society. And when you think about the last time we really went big on some of these place-based policies, it was in that era. And so when I worked in the Obama administration, a lot of my research, obviously at Duke, had been based on place-based economics, on regional economic development. I'd written on that. I worked on a lot of smaller initiatives in the Obama administration, with numbers probably tallying in the single digits in millions. But when I got to the Commerce Department this time around, the American Rescue Plan had passed. And as everyone knows on this call, the American Rescue Plan injected billions of dollars, and $3 billion in particular, to the Economic Development Administration, EDA, to really do a transformational moonshot when it came to regional economic development. And sometimes you worry when you get an injection of new capital, when there's new funding for a program, that we're not going to have the infrastructure, we're not going to have the knowledge, we're not going to have the capabilities to execute. But I think the great thing about it is, first, under the leadership of Secretary Raimondo, who had thought a lot about this when she was governor of Rhode Island and done a lot of work, particularly on jobs and training, and especially with Assistant Secretary Castillo, who has a lot of experience going back to Clinton and Obama administration of the issues. And frankly, this community, and you'll hear from some folks later who work on the inside of this, but we've been doing this work for a long time. And many of us were ready for a moment where we'd be able to operate at scale. And so I came in as the chief economist and tried to inform those efforts at EDA, working together with a team as they devised and executed programs that I think have really been sort of revolutionary in the space we're working at. So when you think about the Build Back Better regional challenge, when you think about the Good Jobs challenge, these are programs that couldn't have existed in early areas because we didn't have the funding to make them a reality. And now, as I'm seeing the impact across the United States, I think we're living in a moment where there's going to be a lot of policy to do, but as importantly for this group, a lot of evaluation, a lot of research, a lot of best practices, and a lot of communities of practice to create in the aftermath of some of these big programs that have happened. So that's kind of when I came into the Commerce Department. The second thing I had on my plate was dealing with supply chain shortages. One of the first questions that the secretary asked me is, where are the chips? And at first I thought she was asking about something to do with the food and beverage assortment at the Commerce Department, but it turned out, she was talking about semiconductors and the shortage of computer chips that was really roiling key industries in the United States, from the medical devices to automobiles most notably, and of course, our defense industry. And I started on this path where I got very deep in terms of the demand and supply for computer chips, the different kinds of chips, the ones that go into our phones, the ones that go into our cars, the ones that go into routers and the grid and our defense systems, and start to learn about the industrial base that was needed in the United States to produce these chips, to have more supply chain resilience, and also to create the kinds of jobs that people want to do here in America, at the same time protecting our national security. And it's really from that the Chips and Science Act came. In August of 2022, I was there when the president signed into law, one of my proudest moments as a public servant. And when that law was passed, they needed someone to come over and coordinate the implementation, to stand up the different programs across the Commerce Department, the Defense Department, the National Science Foundation, Treasury, and state, to make sure that this program worked in the way we want to. And so my colleagues at the agencies are the ones who are doing the lion's share of the work in terms of executing. I've tried to provide where I can the coordination and guidance to make sure that we're all singing from the same book and that it's in accordance with President Biden's values. And I think you're starting to see the fruits of that already. We've released several notices of funding that announce how companies can apply for funding from the CHIPS program. We've received over 400 statements of interest from applicants. I thought it was kind of interesting when we first started to release some of these notices of funding. People were concerned that we wouldn't have enough interest, or that we had added too many things into the applications. But it turns out that the interest in this program is tremendous, and it's been proven again and again with the numbers of folks who are interested on the company side. The second thing we're trying to do is build back research and development in this country, because it's not good enough to just build the manufacturing facilities for chips. You also have to make sure that the innovation is happening in the United States and that we're at the cutting edge. Otherwise, we may lead in this generation, but we won't lead in future generations. And so part of the CHIPS Act is also to build up the research and development apparatus, and also stand up a national semiconductor technology center. So the $52 billion is split between incentives to build manufacturing, incentives to create a research and development infrastructure, as well as a defense research and development program, and diplomatic efforts to make sure we're aligned with our partners and allies. The last piece of the CHIPS program that's notable is a tax credit at the Treasury Department that's going to be a big part of a lot of companies' plans to invest in the United States of America. Taking a step back and taking stock, when you think about the broader industrial strategies, it is necessarily place-based. And I think this is a connection that people are increasingly starting to make. When you build a fab, a semiconductor manufacturing facility, that employs tens of thousands of people, both on the construction side and in the factory themselves, you're beginning to lay down an anchor tenant for what a community can build around. And I saw that myself when I visited with the president, my hometown of Durham, North Carolina. I don't know if Danny planned it this way. We had Assistant Leader Clyburn, of course, from South Carolina. You got other Carolina representing here. And when the president touched down in Durham, he looked out at Wolfspeed, which is a company locally in my backyard that makes silicon carbide wafers. These silicon carbide wafers is the kind of compound semiconductor that's fundamental to creating the chips that go into electric vehicles, because of the high voltage involved in the construction or the operation of the vehicles. Well, there's also an electric vehicle plant coming up in North Carolina. There's also a battery plant proximate to that location in Durham. And even in Charlotte, we have a lithium processing company, Albemarle, who's doing that work. When you start to think of what the president was piecing together in that event, you could start to see the full supply chain coming together, from the silicon carbide that you need to make the chips, the electric vehicles that are going to use those materials, to the battery that's going to be essential to the operation of that vehicle, to the lithium that needs to be processed to build the battery in the first place, all co-located in one spot in North Carolina. And I looked down, I started to think about the thousands and thousands of people who would work at the facilities that were involved, the connections between those companies, and the linkages between our educational institutions, our labor groups, our community groups. I started to see the work that many of you have done for a long time in sort of vivid reality. And I think our challenge for this group is not just to make sure that the money goes out on time. We need to do that. Not just to make sure that we make good decisions and we had good governance. We're going to do that, and it's hard to do, but we'll do that. But also to make sure, going back to Assistant Leader Clyburne's point, that we actually do it differently this time, and we do it better. When you think about prior efforts in industrial policy, I think we made two really big mistakes. One was that we did it in a way that was very carbon intensive, and another is that we actually did not create inclusive opportunity for everyone to come along. We are on the verge of making those mistakes again unless we take purposeful, proactive actions to build the kind of institutions we need at the ecosystem level in places like Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, but all over the country to make sure we don't let that happen again. And I think one of the challenges for this group, when you're thinking about your research, is how our work can inform those decisions. Let me just point out a couple, and then I'll open up for questions and comments, if that's okay, Danny. One is on workforce. I hear a lot of great announcements about workforce, a lot of great excitement about the kind of jobs, and we should be excited. You're talking about thousands and thousands of jobs that don't necessarily require a college degree, that can pay a good wage. And those are opportunities that we should not take lightly. We need to make sure those come to reality. But how are people going to be ready for those jobs? We have the vague sense that community colleges and universities are setting up programs, and they are. We've seen dozens and dozens of those. But I want us all to take a closer look at how many seats are in those classes, what kind of curriculum they have, and whether the numbers are going to add up. How do we scale the workforce and training infrastructure to meet the moment that we're in? Because the way I felt the first day I started the Commerce Department, when I looked at what EDA was able to do in economic development in terms of the funds they had, I realized it was a moment in time that wouldn't come again. And I'm telling you, on the workforce piece, I'm concerned that if we miss this moment to get it right, it won't come again. We won't get the benefit of the doubt to create these kind of infrastructure. And I hope that a large portion of this group is thinking hard, not just about sort of innovative approaches to stand up programs, but how to scale them, how to evaluate them, and how to make sure they actually work. Because a lot of the work that folks do on this ends at the press release, ends at the ribbon cutting, but it needs to go on and on and on. And I hope we can do that going forward with our workforce program. The second thing we need to do that I really want to flag, and there's many other things to work on, is thinking about the innovation engine in the United States of America as it relates to chips. A lot of my students at Duke and my colleagues when I was at Berkeley, they're super excited about software, right? And they wanted to go work in software industries if they have an engineering background. There's a lot of software in chips, everyone knows that, but it's also a hardware business. And if you think about the innovations that are powering tomorrow's sort of artificial intelligence applications, quantum, and even our most advanced defense systems, you're talking about a really important pieces of hardware as well, the kind of chips that can do the work, right, when it comes to large language models and the analytics that we need to do to make this work. That kind of hardware work needs a new generation workforce as well. And we need to make sure we're understanding the pathways, both for innovative people around the world and our domestic workforce to come together to power that side of the chips business as well. And something that I think, I've done a lot of research on in terms of the high-tech workforce, but we need more work given that the industrial mix is changing. When you think about what's happening in America, both with the IRA and the CHIPS Act and infrastructure, it really is a reindustrialization, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to both decarbonize and create sort of the infrastructure of the future, and also build a digital backbone based on domestic chip production and research and development. To make those things work, the workforce is going to be key, and I think this group can help a lot in that endeavor. I'll end by saying I think that it's really, really difficult to build a fab. If you think about what these companies are doing around the country, it's a challenging thing. To build the ecosystem that goes around a fab, the community groups, the educational institutions, the workforce, labor groups, everyone you need to click in to make it work, that's even harder. But to fulfill Assistant Leader Clyburne's promise, which is to bring everybody along and make sure we do it in an inclusive way, that's harder still. And so that really is the challenge that's animating a lot of my work right now at the White House. It's what, when I return to academia, will shape the kind of research and teaching I do. And I hope that I'll be joined by many of you and continue to do this kind of work. I'll stop there and I'll take questions, comments, Danny, if we have some, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues.
Thank you so much. That is the best on the ground view we could possibly have for this amazing rush of legislation that's once in a generation. And thank you for giving us the outline, both of the generalities and the specifics, and what are the bottlenecks that you see that need to be overcome, as you think about your work day to day. And then also what we can do on the outside and thinking about, okay, if we knew X, then that would make Y easier, better, more effective. One question, which I'll start us off with, is the CHIPS Act, was motivated in part by some unique concerns, some extremely concentrated chip manufacturing outside the United States makes us vulnerable. Do you think that the rationale for the CHIPS Act and the regional industrial policy you described, should it stay in that narrow box, or do you kind of see it broader than that? And then, what's that broader rationale? What economic activity should policy be nudging towards certain areas and away from others, and which ones should policy just kind of be agnostic to?
It's a great question. I see it broader than that. I do think that the national security implications of chips and bringing more production of chips to the United States are really important. When you think about the way markets work, they're relatively agnostic about the location of production. And so if all of it's geographically concentrated in one part of the world, it might not necessarily in some markets be as significant of an issue. In this market, it really matters. And we've seen this time and time again as the geopolitical context shifts. And so I think it is really important from a national security standpoint to make sure that we're doing some of this here in the United States. And frankly, chips go into everything. So it's not just the defense industrial complex, but it's also, or the defense industrial base, it's also, sort of key parts of the consumer economy, key parts of an energy transition. So that piece is going to be key. But on the economic side, this is also an opportunity to create some really high quality jobs in an innovative and fast moving industry. And the kinds of jobs we can create are really unique, especially given some of the, compared to some of the industries traditionally that we've been developing here. So I think it's a great chance to build back manufacturing in the US as well. And from a economic security standpoint, I was working here at a time when supply chain disruptions were really causing a lot of challenges. 1/3 of inflation in 2021 was coming from core CPI, was coming from car prices. And a lot of the car price increases were because we couldn't get access to chips. And so watching companies start to get more visibility in their supply chain, take supply chain resiliency more and more seriously, it seems to me that there's strong economic security reasons for the private sector and the public sector to think about sort of diversifying the sources of where chips are coming from. And I think you're seeing that play out in supply chain decisions across the global economy. To me, it's a broader story, and it connects to a lot of the things that folks in the place-based economic research community are thinking about. Because again, this is going to involve a lot of large investments, key complementary supply chain investments, as well as a wraparound ecosystem to really make these world-leading facilities. And so I think it's part and parcel on the national security and economic security side in a way that's really hard to get right, but something I really believe in terms of the sport.
Thank you. And we've got two other questions that I'll just combine into one, and then say thanks, Ronnie, and we'll segue into panel one on this exact topic. So Liz Brown and Christiana McFarland have workforce questions. One component is, how do you think about improving access marginalized communities to job opportunities in the fabs coming online? Is it education, transportation? How do you think about that? And then just, at a higher level, what workforce investments or policy changes is the administration or beyond that thinking about for opportunities to address the workforce population gap that's exacerbating, regionally and where manufacturing was a major focus in the past, like the Midwest and Rust Belt?
So thanks for the questions. I'll be brief, knowing that you want to stay on, but this is a really important set of issues, and I'm glad to talk to folks offline if they want to reach out. I think you nailed them in terms of the barriers to access. If folks don't have the right training to go work in those facilities that I talked about in my hometown, if they don't have the transportation to get to and from work, and if they don't have the affordable housing to live proximate to their workplace, this isn't going to work. And I think when you talk to mayors, and I find that mayors are some of the folks who are closest to what's going on the ground, they will cite those issues as some of the biggest challenges to making this all work, for marginalized communities who haven't traditionally been in this industry, and for everyone who's going to work in this industry going forward. I think we need to take seriously a couple propositions. One is that we have a large percentage of our employment in services, not manufacturing. And when you think about building up an industrial economy again in a way we haven't done for a generation, you need to think about people moving not just to a new job, but from services to manufacturing and getting a new set of skills. And that's something we need to think about holistically, because there are different kinds of jobs. And a lot of folks, and I know this just talking to folks about the jobs at the companies that are already setting up shop, they don't think of themselves working in manufacturing, right? And it hasn't been something that's been an option to them, particularly if you don't see people who look like you or people in your family who work there. So we got to do a lot of work to figure that out, to get people in the door. The training needs to be accessible and affordable and give people an on-ramp to a real job. You know, I think too many of our programs, I learned this from Secretary Raimondo, we sort of train and pray. And I think in some sense, training for an actual job that exists is really important. And that means like thinking up with employers at the very beginning to make sure that some of these things actually, you know, are more likely to end up in a real job is key. The quality of the job is the last thing. What's going to keep people in a job at the end of the day are the benefits and the job attributes that we know that, you know, people are looking for. And so when we released the notice of funding for CHIPS, one of the things we talked about is a plan to provide childcare. Why? Right? Because at the end of the day, if you want to attract folks who try to work in manufacturing, right, you're going to have to think about the kind of benefits that are going to bring them in. And for parents, right, but it particularly affects women, right, you think about like childcare as a key attribute in every survey. And so when we put that out there was a lot of folks who were, you know, asking questions nationally about it. In the end, though, a lot of these businesses are providing those services in other parts of the world. Why not here? Why not for the workforce that we have here in the United States of America? And so that's what we've been thinking about in terms of trying to design the program. I would say, just in closing, I want to thank folks for their interest in all this. I know the panel coming next will delve into these issues, and there's lots of room for improvement. And so I think keeping like a dialogue between communities like this and the work we're doing here is really key. Even if we sometimes see things differently, I really benefit from the conversation and feedback, and I'm hoping to keep in touch with folks going forward on this. And Danny, thanks again to you and Hillary for this event.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Couldn't have been a more perfect lead into this panel discussion we're about to have, and thank you for setting up the bird's eye view, and then also just on the ground, like what are the challenges you're trying to overcome as dollars are moving out the door. So thank you, Ronnie, for your time today and the service toward the ends that we're all focused on here in this conference.